Welcome to Executives at the Edge, a podcast brought to you by MEF. I'm your host, Pascal Menezes. Join me as we explore thought-provoking perspectives from the leaders and changemakers who are propelling enterprise digital transformation forward. I'm really excited to have Greg Bryan, Senior Manager, Enterprise Research at TeleGeography. Greg, welcome to Executives at the Edge. And I believe in this episode, we're going to cover a lot about SD-WAN, how well it's being adopted, what are the use cases, is it replacing MPLS, how does it play into SASE, and finally, how does all of this tie back to NaaS? So Greg, again, welcome to Executives at the Edge. And for our listeners, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and TeleGeography, that'd be really appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Pascal. Thanks so much for having me. Good to see you. I don't think we've spoken since the last GNE, so it's great to be in touch again. Like you said, I'm the Senior Manager of Enterprise Research at TeleGeography. I'll start with a brief intro of TeleGeography, if anyone out there doesn't know us. We are a boutique market research firm that's totally focused on the global telecom market. We cover telecom infrastructure, pricing, maps. A lot of people know us for our submarine cable maps or our data center maps, that sort of thing. That's where the geography part comes in. My particular role there is that I manage our research that is for and about the non-telecom enterprise community. So most of what we do at TeleGeography was designed kind of with the service provider or telecom vendor in mind, tracking all the pricing of services and network footprints and that sort of thing. And I worked with all those folks to kind of package our data in a way that's useful for network managers at large multinationals that would have a need for understanding the sort of global telecom market. And then I also do some research about the enterprise WAN world. So that's what we're mostly going to be talking about today, I think. We do a research product called the WAN Manager Survey, where I reach out to, usually most years like 65, 75 or so WAN managers that are in charge of large multinational networks at kind of, Fortune 1000 size companies around the world. And I get a really sort of in-depth feel for where they are with their network transformations, what they're looking forward to, and those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of a unique angle at TeleGeography, since everything else we do is really research about the telecom industry itself. I get to kind of look at the buy side or the demand side of that a little bit more than my colleagues.
Well, Greg, that certainly is really, really impressive. I think you talked about the WAN side. So I think the $1 million question is, there's been a lot of WAN technologies, and SD-WAN has certainly become one of these top of mind technologies. What are your thoughts? Has SD-WAN become the norm for enterprise networks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, my top line answer is yes, that it has. I remember you and I discussing this many, many years ago at one of our WAN Summit events, probably like 2016, 2017, when things were just starting. And even back then, we were thinking, hey, this is going to take over. It took a little bit longer, I think, than we thought. For one thing, there was that whole COVID thing that slowed down a lot of network transformations and that sort of thing. I think also it turned out to be maybe a little bit harder of a nut to crack than some people anticipated. But I'll say this, our survey that we've been running since 2018, back then, 2018. So, SD-WAN is pretty new then. About 1 in 5, 21% of folks that we asked then had already installed SD-WAN. This past year, the end, basically Q4 of 2023, we redid our survey, and that was up to 63%. So pretty strong majority of the enterprise market, as we see it, has adopted SD-WAN. There's another 20% in that survey that are in the rollout phase. So you're looking at maybe 3/4 of the market probably by now in terms of our respondents that have rolled out SD-WAN. little caveat there that the kinds of folks that I get to talk to, WAN managers that have consumed our data, that have met at a conference, that kind of thing, might be a little bit more forward thinking and acting than just the total broad market. But I think it's still pretty safe to say that SD-WAN has really sort of fully become the norm within the enterprise world. Again, with that little pause due to COVID in terms of rollouts being actually able to happen. And I should say, Pascal, one just little addendum to that is that that we've seen now maybe second or third deployments at some enterprises. So it's been around long enough now that you've had folks decide, well, this particular vendor or this situation didn't work out for me, so I'm now on to my next kind of SD-WAN rollout. So I think definitely it is the norm in the enterprise now.
So that is really nice to hear. So what are your thoughts? Is it mainly multinationals doing it themselves? Is it, do-it-yourself model, DIY? Or is it managed that they're buying, and has it gone downstream into the large and mid-tier kind of enterprises? Where is this adoption happening that you just talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I'll say is that our survey definitely focuses on the larger multinational, like I said, for various reasons, but one being that's who is kind of in our universe, who would find our data interesting, who would go to an event like GNE, for example, or the WAN summit that we used to run, tend to be the multinationals. So that's who I talk to the most. That said, I have also gone to other events that are more sort of regional in focus. And yeah, I mean, for sure, SD-WAN is useful even if you have a handful of sites, like a dozen sites maybe, right? So particularly if you were running MPLS for those sites. So I do think it's worked its way down to smaller companies as well. And I should also say, Pascal, that, when I go to MEF and we're talking to, the bigger carriers and the bigger vendors and things like that, there's a very long tail of SD-WAN providers out there. And some of them are actually in business really to serve those kind of more smaller companies, probably some folks that folks even on listening to this podcast had never even heard of. So we track kind of the SD-WAN marketplace in that sense. And there's a lot of providers out there still. It's consolidated a lot over the last few years, but some of them are really truly focused on that kind of like SOHO even to mid-market enterprise there. So I definitely think it's across the whole spectrum. I have literally seen like situations where somebody has half a dozen sites and they still rolled out SD-WAN. So yeah, I think it definitely has worked its way all around. Then you had a second question that I've forgotten now. I'm sorry, because I get so into it.
It's okay. Yeah. I think I wanted to know, was it mainly a DIY, or I think the multinationals
yes.
were doing DIYs, or are they really all now buying it from the service providers, a managed offering, or co-managed?
And right. So that, and for that, I would say it's a mixed bag, where co-managed is the plurality. So and again, this is probably sort of influenced a bit by the kinds of folks who would respond to me, right? But they want to retain some control, I think, for the most part. But also, nobody has the size network team that you need these days for the complexity of the systems out there. I do have a couple of respondents that are really tech savvy and have huge teams. I had one respondent that's a fintech company that has a network team of 400. That's really unusual, There's other respondents I talked to that have network team of hundreds of sites around the world, and they have 6 network engineers, right? So definitely some level of management is the norm. We talked to fairly few that just go all DIY, but I think within that some level of management, there is a degree of control that a lot of them want to keep. So they go for that kind of co-managed sort of arrangement. I will say this, Pascal, it's a little bit orthogonal to your question, but I think it relates in a good way, which is that we've also asked over the years, like, who do you source your network from? So I mean, like the underlay. And that has moved away from this one-stop shop kind of global providers towards a more fractured sort of sourcing strategy. I think certainly still the most prominent carriers are the ones that you would think, your AT&T, Verizon, Orange, BT, et cetera. But part of what SD-WAN has done has allowed these enterprises, multinationals, to maybe go to a best-in-breed DIA provider in this particular region, or even for MPLS, we've seen that as well. So there's a kind of a more of a mixed bag. So in that situation, if I'm getting my underlay from a variety of carriers, I think it's very likely that maybe I'm going directly to the vendor, even if it's managed, or maybe an MSP for my overlay, for example.
That's a very interesting question. So I guess, will MPLS disappear with SD-WAN? I mean, really fundamentally, SD-WAN is an overlay technology. It can run on any underlays. So what's the impact? Do we see there's the hybrid, internet loop, and then there's the MPLS loop, and it was traditionally line of businesses, mission critical around the MPLS loop, and things that were non-mission critical on the internet loop. Is this finally transitioning that the technology is so evolved that it can run on two internet loops and still simulate that high quality, mission critical capabilities? Interesting to see how SD-WAN now has evolved a decade later plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, the place I would start with that is that we have direct data, which is that in 2018, I started asking what is the makeup of your underlay network, right? So what percentage of your sites are running all of these services? I'm mainly going to talk about MPLS versus internet, like DIA and broadband, but we ask about satellite and point-to-point and everything like that. And MPLS was, the strong leader for a long time. In 2018, 82% of sites on average in our survey were running MPLS. By 2023, MPLS had fallen to a minority of sites, so it's actually only at 41% of sites on average now. So we've seen exactly what I like to say that, as an analyst, we get asked to predict the future a lot. That this one was maybe low-hanging fruit, that MPLS would decline, right, over the next several years. So that's cool that we got that right? But certainly MPLS usage has declined. That is in two respects. Like you mentioned, you may keep some MPLS and add in a local breakout instead of doing a centralized breakout. Much more efficient anyway, but you can do SD-WAN with an MPLS as one of your lines and DIA as the other one, load balancing across those two, et cetera. We see some enterprises definitely who have gone pretty much all internet, right? And we've talked to a lot more who say that's their ultimate goal, right? So even if they haven't achieved that yet, because it takes time to rip and replace and figure all these things out and whatnot. I think certainly we've seen real enterprises actually out there running their networks with almost nothing but internet and maybe some point-to-point in there as well. That said, Pascal, I don't think MPLS is going to disappear entirely, certainly anytime soon. There are certain situations out there. China is the big one that we see a lot in our research, where enterprises will indicate we can't get all internet kind of service in China because of how internet works in China, right? The Great Firewall and dragging everything back to Hong Kong and that sort of thing. But other situations too, geographically, for example, lots of other regions where maybe the internet performance just really isn't adequate compared to that sort of carrier grade MPLS with dedicated local access circuits and that sort of thing. And then other situations, I think even in sort of more developed markets where MPLS just is going to have some sticking power, whether it's conservative kind of industries that have a lot of compliance and reporting and things like that, and they're just not willing to go to the scary internet even with SD-WAN, or situations where we've talked to some enterprises where they have a lot of data centers still on premises, and they find that it's easier to sort of connect their offices back to that hub with MPLS than doing a sort of internet only kind of routing for that. So long story short, I actually do a little forecast of this. I have MPLS continuing to decline from where it is, even at less than half of sites on average, but I do think there'll be some kind of leveling off point where it's still around, but not not prominent part of the market like it used to be. Pascal, for what it's worth, I'm sure that you and many of the listeners will remember this, but I mean, I've talked to enterprises still in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years that had sites running frame relay, right? And so, these things tend to die hard, or for that matter, we certainly see lots of, still, STEM ones and OC3, that kind of thing out there in the world, right? T1s and E1s are still out there, believe it or not. So, these legacy technologies diminish, but it takes a lot to make them, entirely disappear,
Yeah, it's so interesting, Brian. It's, if it's working, don't mess with it.
Right, exactly.
But, one of my questions is, we've been doing carrier Ethernet for so long, and carrier Ethernet can go into massive speeds, to 100 gigabits to going to 400 to 800 gigabits per second. Does DIA have that ability to run those speeds? They do. You see that's actually, you can get those kind of speeds at DIA?
Yeah, we don't. I haven't seen that, to be honest. No, I mean, I think at that, when you're talking 400 gig, 800 gig, you're first of all, it would make sense to have a point-to-point connection. I think at that stage, we do see higher capacity DIA, like much, like 10 gig, certainly.
Okay, so you do see 10
the
gig.
demand for that's still pretty low. So I think most enterprises, when they're doing an any-to-any service, it's still the case that GigE is a pretty big circuit, right? So you got to keep this in mind, Pascal, that when we're talking about, we're replacing MPLS, a few years ago, if you had asked me what's the most typical ports connection at a typical branch office of an MNC, it was like 20 to 50 megs of MPLS, right? So the world has changed a lot. We track the bandwidth demand in this survey as well, and that has shifted definitely towards the higher end. We've seen everything 50 megs and below, kind of demand has sunk on average about 15% or so over the last 5 years, whereas the demand for everything above 50 megs has gone up, but still in your typical enterprise deployment, you're seeing office connectivity at like 500 megs, a gig. Bigger headquarter campuses are getting 10 gig, multiple 10 gig DIA ports maybe. If you're connecting data centers, that's when they get into the 100 gig, 400 gig, but even that's for a pretty sophisticated kind of enterprise. So bandwidth demand is certainly rising rapidly, but you're not hitting the carrier Ethernet levels like that yet.
I think mainly carrier Ethernet came in because they could create their own layer 2 VPN between all their sites and to their clouds now. And so then they could overlay their own layer 3 routing.
Right.
But that was more geared for multinationals saying, I want a layer 2 fabric, and then it's private secure, and then, I'm going to overlay my layer 3 fabric so I get my own private IP network. But yet we're moving to a world where it's saying, hey, like SASE, just take an IP loop from either broadband or DIA, and then basically connect to the nearest POP. At that POP is where the SASE sits and lives.
Yep.
And basically runs the SD-WAN functions, the cybersecurity functions, kicks me on my clouds for middle miles or regional clouds, or all the connectivity happens on a business network from there on in. But my first mile is an internet loop because it's ubiquitous. I can get anywhere, broadband DIA. What are your thoughts about this, and how does it all kind of munge in with SASE? Like, SASE's really become top of mind. SD-WAN's kind of become the lagger. Can we pull back? I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this, how this all come together. Yeah,
absolutely. So, this is something, Pascal, I end up talking about a lot. So I'll try to be brief, right? But I like to pull back and look at the sort of the big picture of how and why the enterprise WAN has evolved. And to make that long story as short as possible, obviously, the move to cloud had a really big impact on this. All these cloud tools, we're using one to record this podcast, right? Like in an internet browser, right? All these cloud tools were born on the internet, were designed to work on the internet. They didn't work well with MPLS because you had to break all that traffic out centrally, have the DMZ, the security at that central location. I am old enough to remember when you used to buy software, put it in an optical drive and have a key or even a zip drive before that, right? And, just when we moved away from doing anything that way, and when we moved away from having data centers on premises, right? So we see the vast majority of folks have some amount of data centers on premises, but most of their data centers are off-prem, neutral facilities, that kind of thing. It just makes so much more sense to break out internet traffic locally. obviously one of the big hangups with that always was okay, so now the security perimeter of my network has grown, metastasized, right? So the castle and moat thing is gone. You're not any longer in a world where I'm in the network after I breach it and I get everything I want, everybody to be able to just access the things they need over the internet. So we started asking about this in our survey before SASE was a term, right? So I started collecting data kind of on like, what's your rollout on zero trust, which, the zero trust concept certainly worked its way into what became the SASE framework. So when I first asked about this in a survey, we asked, have you installed zero trust? And this is 2019, I think. And it was just 8% back then, right? So that was very, very small amount of the market. By this past quarter four 2023, it was up to 43% when we asked about, have you installed SASE, right? So that's a much faster uptake than it was for SD-WAN, for example. I think because everyone saw the benefit of going toward, sort of the local internet breakouts. I should also mention, as a quick aside, not to mention the cost, right? So DIA, broadband especially, are much cheaper than MPLS service, and you can increase your bandwidth and maybe be paying the same price, that kind of thing. So we've seen SASE uptake go very quickly. We've seen that when I first started asking about, again, zero trust, not SASE, but close enough, in 2019, most folks didn't even really know what it was, right? And now almost everybody kind of is familiar with SASE. Even if they haven't deployed it yet, it's something they're looking into and that they're interested in. They know that they need to do. So I think the vendors, the carriers, the MSPs did a really good job with organizing that SASE framework, that concept, into something that enterprises could execute on. Of course, you guys at MEF had a hand in that, so thanks to you guys, I think, as well for that. So I think the enterprise market has really sort of caught on to that for sure.
What's really important now is we're seeing SD-WAN pulled by the SASE market, so it gets even more adopted.
Yeah.
SD-WAN actually allows you to build your own private network, right? So your virtual private network on an overlay technology, regardless of the underlays, and then plugs into your cybersecurity in the cloud, which is all, belongs to you. It's secured. It's your private connectivity, your private security. And so that's really powerful. And I think with all of this kind of modernization of everything going to the cloud, as you talked about, it becomes really important. Now, at MEF, we're doing our network as a service, which is about as a service coming from the cloud, as we talked about, which includes, all your underlays, connectivity being on demand and all automated, and, the overlay technology of SD-WAN we talked about, cybersecurity and now multi-cloud, all of this coming together from a cloud deployment, cloud experience. So what's your thoughts on this market? I mean, it's kind of we've been talking about for NaaS for a decade, but it was mainly site to site, site to data center. Now it's a modern NaaS that we're talking about, site to clouds and your cybersecurity mixed in with your bandwidth, your private network, your policies, your application performance. How do you see this NaaS market appearing? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I've been trying to nail down, honestly, as well, because we're hearing a lot from you guys, from the carriers, and NaaS is exciting, and the technology is there to make it a reality, and that's really cool. I do think the enterprises are a little bit lagging on this. Like, to some extent, I think it might even be that they've been so focused on, we know we need to adopt SD-WAN. Now we have SASE in that mix, and like you said, certainly the SASE has made SD-WAN even more important. Network managers are busy folks. They spend most of their time putting out fires, right? So I think that's part of it here, is just that, sort of this new thing that now I have to understand this has been another challenge. So we've seen uptake on NaaS to be pretty slow. We've asked about it just for 2 years because, for 2 years now, that where it's been sort of a commercially available product in a grand sense, only about 8% of our respondents had already installed NaaS on at least in some situations. So a very small amount of the market. Now those who had, it's a small number, but those who had were really excited about it, love the idea. And I think a lot of it does depend on, sort of your line of business. Do you have very bursty traffic? Do you have situations like retail is one where we had some respondents that were already very all in on NaaS because retail is inherently kind of very seasonal, and so you can really see the sort of ebb and flow bandwidth use case there. The place where I think that the carriers are succeeding right now, right, is in education. We've definitely seen that the awareness and interest of NaaS has grown just since 2022. So I think that's important. But I've definitely talked to some enterprises that are a little bit struggling to like put that technology that they think is maybe really cool to a specific use case for them. So there are specific use cases we can all think of where, stadiums, live events, that kind of thing, right? Where it's a no-brainer, right? Your traffic is like incredibly bursty and those kinds of things. The other hang up that I think enterprises are having is from the budgeting standpoint, right? So if I go to my sourcing team who reports to the CFO, not to the not on the network tech IT side necessarily, and say, hey, my bill for network is going to be really variable depending on what we need. Right? So, even if they're trying to say like, hey, it could be less because we're only going to buy what we need or whatever, they're reaching hurdles of just rethinking the sort of budgetary aspect, right? Of like, how do I work this out? How do I think about this? So I think there's a little work to be done there from the carriers to educate the enterprise on the use cases, on how to deal with it and that sort of thing. But I definitely think that the technology itself, like the promise of that has a lot of promise. I think we just have to wait for kind of the enterprises to settle into, hey, we've already done these big network transformations, and we need to think about why this is going to benefit us and how the network is really changing now. I think that's something, Pascal, that I talk about with the end users often, which is that they were so used to, as those folks who've been doing networking a long time, being purely reactive. Like, this is what we're doing from the CTO or whatever, and we need network for it, to getting into a different role where now the network might be driving some of the things that we do in IT rather than just responding to it. And I think NaaS really has a role there. So definitely excited to see how it develops in the few years, but we're at the very early stages from what I see in the data.
Well, Greg, I think from my point of view, I talk about NaaS I talk about if you need on-demand connectivity, which is all automation, just call it, I have my on-demand network. You don't have to label it NaaS, but your vision is still NaaS because it's part of the NaaS vision. You don't have to say NaaS as an offering. You can just say, I'll give you, Mr. Customer, I'll give you an on-demand connectivity for IP or carry Ethernet or wavelengths. And today, maybe they don't have an SD-WAN offering or SASE offering. They might have a cloud offering, a multi-cloud connectivity to all the hyperscalers. So say, today, Mr. Customers, I'll give you connectivity to all your sites at these speeds, and I'll give you connectivity to clouds. And they don't have to say NaaS at all. But it's really still part of the subsets that make up NaaS. And over time, as the market matures, they naturally can go, oh, I have a NaaS story. I have a NaaS product of all the parts that finally make up NaaS. So you might not have the commercial models yet, I'm saying, because it's a very different commercial model than, a contractual model. My point is, when we talk about NaaS, we see that as a vision in the future. We don't think that everybody has to jump to a NaaS bandwagon. We think that you can crawl, walk, and run to there. So to me, that's a very important part I want to convey. So. No,
I think I agree with that 100%. It's very much like the cloud transformation, right? So that that changed the network. That took a lot of time, right? It was, and there was a lot of kicking and screaming. I'm sure there were various IT folks about, I'm really going to put my data center into this like neutral facility, right? I don't have control over it. And look where we are now, right? So.
Well, Greg, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being on this episode. Look forward to seeing you at GNE in Dallas, end of October, our global NaaS event in Dallas. So happy you were able to do this episode with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I should say, Pascal, you've been on my podcast a couple of times. It was really fun to be answering rather than asking the questions. So it's great to reverse the roles here. So thanks. Yeah.
No worries.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us for Executives at the Edge. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe today. Share online a review. Find all our episodes on your favorite podcast platform and at MEF.net.